Hey everybody, welcome back to the Hagstone podcast. Today I'm talking to Ben Reid-Howells about his initiative Deep Roots Alba, which is, from what I understand, helping folks of the northern world and folks of reclaiming Gaelic culture and Scottish heritage to find an intersection around activism and ancestry, especially uh, in engagement with people of culture as who are fighting systemic oppression. And I'm really excited to speak with Ben today about this initiative and also our shared work in the world. Thanks for being on, Ben.
Yeah, it's a delight and a treat, Chase.
It really is. And so to start off, I'd love to just give you the space to talk a little bit about your story and the initiative behind Deep Roots Alba and how that intersects with your personal um, heritage and identity.
Absolutely. So I'll introduce myself the way that my ancestors would have done, and still do in some parts of mostly the west coast of Scotland and across Ireland in the Gaeltach, the Gaelic speaking world. Smisha Bain, Richa Howell, Ben Mach Gavi, Ik Eric is Nile Howell, Ben Mach Loose, Ich Ian agus Marsali Richa a Pitlochri Alpa agus a Carmili Alpa agus Cymru. So that's me introducing myself on my mother and father's side, naming as many generations back as I can go, which for me is just three generations now. That's all I know of my parents' sides and where they're from, being the north of Wales from my dad on one side, and Carmily, which is central eastern Highlands of Scotland, and my mum's people from Pitlochry, which is also central eastern Highlands of Scotland. And the way I got into this work was very much growing up as a Canadian in so-called Canada. And we say so-called Canada because to lots of Indigenous folks, Canada is a very thin, young, new idea that they refute entirely. So growing up in the colony, as a first generation Canadian, so my mum being from Scotland, my dad being more or less from England, though born in Uganda. And growing up here, just sort of sensing from a young age, like something's not quite right. Something's missing in the people around me, in the culture. From an early age, from 10, 12, just thinking, wow, all people do is spend time in shopping malls. And yet seeing other friends of ours, we grew up with lots of other immigrant families who were really rooted in their, Persian Canadian ancestry or Pakistani Canadian or Nigerian Canadian ancestry. And here we were as sort of Scottish, Welsh, English, British, whatever Canadians. And I'd say to my family, my parents, like, right, what are our songs? What are our people's creation stories, having learnt the Anishinaabe indigenous creation story? And they'd sort of look at me like, what do you mean? What are you on about? And then quite young, I went to Scotland the first time when I was weeks old because my mum's parents died. So over my life, I was quite sort of connected to Scotland and then went as a teenager and just felt this deep, like I'd plugged into a wall socket, this charging up through my whole body. And ever since then, kind of sensing like that thing that felt missing is there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but then being back in Canada, in Turtle Island, Ontario, Southern Ontario, which is the most developed, most, I would say in many ways, kind of colonial, colonized part of Canada, um, not knowing what that looked like, not knowing what my songs were, what my traditions were, and seeing lots of other people like me, white skinned settlers borrowing from other cultures, sometimes in a consensual form of appropriation, often in an unconsensual form of appropriation, and thinking like that, yoga, great, Buddhism, amazing, indigenous culture, so beautiful and inspiring, but none of that's for me. So what is for me? And as I was in my early 20s at university, very involved in um, Indigenous allyship, solidarity work, and showing up to front lines with Indigenous nations reclaiming their land, fighting for their land, fighting against the Canadian military and petrochemical industry, and saying, thanks for showing up. as a, as a supporter, as an ally, you've been helpful. Go figure out who you are. And then you'll be much more helpful. Go figure out who your people are, what your roots are. So I left school. I left the kind of world of academia that felt, again, more and more colonial as I went deeper into it, less and less useful for the kind of frontline struggles I was becoming increasingly enmeshed in. And I thought, right, I'll head back towards Scotland slowly overland, following sort of volunteer projects to learn how different communities in different parts of the world are carrying out direct action projects, getting things done. So that took me to my first volunteer gig I lined up, which was in India, teaching at a United World College, which I had studied at previously, an amazing movement of colleges around the world. And I made great pals with an Indian friend from Bihar named Prashant. And I said to him, mate, I'm buying a motorcycle and I'm going to ride to Scotland. What do you reckon? Shall we do it? And he said, hell yeah. So he and I both had a bike, a Royal Enfield, which is like the old, every village in India has a Royal Enfield, and you can irrigate a field with it. You can turn it into a school bus. And so we had our two Royal Enfields, and we set out on this journey that was going to be 6 months, India to Scotland, his motherland to mine. We called it the Vasudhaiva Ride, inspired by the old Sanskrit phrase Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which translates to the whole world is one family.
Mm.
And we set out, and it didn't take us 6 months. It took us about 3.5 years. We
Mm.
had a welding machine, grinding machine with us, his dog, Buddy, for about 14,000 miles, a pit bull bulldog rescue dog. And as we went, the work really developed and changed until in Prashant's native Bihar, we stopped for a year and built the Center of Resilience, which is a grassroots direct action climate justice center that until recently I was co-directing with him. We worked with refugees, asylum seekers in Lesbos, in the largest refugees camps in Europe, in Greece, and made our way to Scotland finally, and got stuck in northeast Glasgow former mining communities, and really witnessing the deep colonization of the Scottish people, especially working class communities. And for years, I was based in the northeast of Glasgow, kind of getting like reintroduced to Scotland. And in that time, I met my first Gaelic culture bearer, Agav O'Brien, who is a dear sort of older brother to me now. And he said, mate, you're doing all this work for all these other communities. You need to reconnect with your roots. So he picked me up in his minivan, took me out into the Highlands, and at one point said, right, no more English. English has done enough to harm these lands, and switched to Gaelic, of which I didn't have a word, and started blethering away at me in Gaelic and took me through the land, took me up Donad, the hill fort where Gaelic chieftains have been named for thousands of years, put my foot in the foot groove at the top of the mountain that the feet of all the Gaelic peoples have been through for a long time, and reintroduced me to the north, south, east, west, taught me my name in Gaelic, which is Ben Reid-Howells, meaning mountain. Ben is like Ben Nevis.
Mhm.
Richa means sort of rust-colored. And Howell is the Welsh on my dad's side, which I still don't know the exact meaning of. But I essentially from there, I haven't looked back. The next thing Agav and I did together was welcome a group of Mohawk folk, Haudenosaunee folk from close to where I am now in Turtle Island, who were the mother and daughter who created the first Mohawk language school since colonization. And for 3 days, we were atop Donad, the same hill fort, with a full Highland armed guard, 6-foot claymore, swords, and everything, defending that site while we carried out ceremony for 3 days, Mohawk and Gaelic tradition.
Mm.
And that's sort of been what I've been up to ever since, is bringing together activists around Scotland who are burning themselves out, defending the rights of working class communities, asylum seekers, etc., and Gaelic culture bearers and tradition bearers who are yearning to connect with the next generation and pass down the sort of indigenous knowledge of the Gaelic Highlands, which is, we're down to the last native speakers, and they'll all be passing away this generation if we don't learn and pass on their traditions. So that led me to think, well, I might as well do this in an organized manner. And I launched a this week collective called Deep Roots, and Deep Roots Alba, Alba being one of the old names for Scotland, is how I'm currently organizing this work, which is started as kind of gatherings, retreats on the land where I'd bring together young Scottish activists, organizers, and elders, tradition bearers, Gaelic language speakers, tr folks from the traveler community and just have the crack together on the land, be immersed in this epic pre-colonial rich culture and really fill our boots, fill our cups, fill our hearts, and then go back to the various struggles that we all belong to. And since then, the work has grown to involve lots of diaspora folk like myself, lots of people who are sort of, pan-Gaelic, Canadian, American, Kiwi, etc., 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 as well as Indigenous folk who are, a quarter Irish or Scottish and need that connection with those Gaelic roots to heal that part of their colonial history. So the work is very much about helping people reconnect with those Gaelic roots and also how do we interrupt the active systems of colonial harm and violence that the
Mm.
Gaels have now become very much part of, right, in the colonies. So that's it in a nutshell. I'm very much learning myself all the time what my role is in the work as a sort of Scottish Canadian. But it's magic and it's really growing arms and legs beyond me and finding, the right kind of support. And I get to work with amazing people like Agav and Aoife Ní who's from Ireland but doing incredible work in Scotland just now, and Peter Nannon, the Hyde Tanner, and just such incredible humans. Gary Neo from the Haudenosaunee from Six Nations, who I just got to do an event with last week here in Turtle Island in her territory. So I think it's rebuilding a bridge that needs to be rebuilt outside of the colonial narrative of what does it mean for us of people of Gaelic origin to stand up in solidarity with in a good way with Indigenous folks whose land we're on, and in Scotland, how do we reclaim well-being essentially as colonized peoples over there?
Mm. Wow. I yeah, just I feel all the threads, right? The big prayer inside of
Hmm.
there, and
Hmm.
the ways it's led you on to this unfurling of what you're doing. And I really was feeling the resonance with kind of got told have gotten told multiple times, and probably we will all get continue to get told of like you would be a lot more helpful if you figured out where your roots were
Hmm.
from the people of culture in. And I really feel like that's been um, when I have been shared that prodding in my life, it really has transformed things. And I think it's kind of nascent in there in your story of like how connecting with our roots and helping them um, find unfurling in the soil of where we really or where we are, like how where you're at in your life, how would you sort of speak to that connection?
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely, Chase. So I think of Unistoten, which is a nation in the northwest of Turtle Island. Decidedly not Canada. I wouldn't even say they're in so-called Canada because they legally proved in a 1996, I think, court case they never signed anything over and they have never ceded their territory. So the Unistoten Nation, like every indigenous nation in Canada, was colonized, and people were displaced off the land. And then probably about maybe 20 years ago now, Frida Hewson, a woman of the Unistoten Nation, a mum living in the town, in the colonial town nearby, made a Facebook post saying, "Give this post one like, and I'm taking our land back." And then 5 minutes later, you see liked by Frida Hewson, and then a comment by Frida Hewson, "Okay, that'll do." And Frida created the Unistoten blockade and started blocking all these giant global oil and gas companies from digging up the Wedzin River and started calling for allies. And I went to Unistoten when I was about 19 for the first time. So, gosh, however long ago that is, 16 years ago. Um, and I was told, thanks for showing up, thanks for chopping wood and, being a unskilled laborer, go figure out where you're from and then come back. And I did. And years later, going back over the years, I've gone back several times. having gotten stuck into my roots in Scotland and having learnt a bit of Gaelic and learnt some songs and practices and protocol also, I think is a huge thing for me as a wanting to show up as an ally in a good way, to have learnt a sense of protocol in my own culture has hugely helped me show up to any other culture, because all pre-colonial cultures have a very clear protocol. How do you talk to an elder? How do you enjoy a meal? How do you enter a space? How do you give or receive a gift? How do you understand your role and responsibility in a place? How do you understand allyship? All of this without protocol leads to the kind of messes we often see in well-intended forms of allyship that don't go well. So anyway, going back to Unistoten, being able to share songs in Gaelic, share stories of our Gaelic cosmology, and being able to honor their protocol from a place of my own cultural protocol, they said, right, build a cabin and stay here as long as you like. You're welcome. So that for me was a very tangible understanding of how that difference shows up in being welcomed in, but also not showing up. The way they often put it was, and other indigenous nations I've worked with, is showing up as a hungry ghost, as they often call it now, of like often white people, but any person who's disconnected from culture, regardless of skin color, showing up and just yearning to collect and collect and collect and learn and, do sweat lodge and pray the way that they pray, whereas being able to show up knowing exactly how my people connect with nature. Right now, I'm learning about the Celtic tradition of the sweat house, which goes back thousands of years in pre-colonial Gaelic culture. That allows me to show up not feeling like an empty vessel that needs to kind of leach or soak up culture, but being able to show up with my own nourishment that I can even put on the table and say, look, we've all had a rough day. Let me share this wee song. And I had one magic moment sitting with Randy, who's the hereditary chief of the Secwepemc Nation, which is a bit inland from Unistoten, kind of Kamloops area. And he invited me into a sweat lodge with an old friend, Nathalie Ewale Montilla from Venezuela. And we were sweating, and he said, Ben, do you have any songs? And I said, well, I don't have any sweat songs from my people, but I have some songs in Gaelic. And he said, I go on. So I sang an old Gaelic tune, Chi mina morvina, oh chi mina morvina, oh chi mina corvina, oh chi mina corchin, chi mina scorin fochio. And after a while, kind of coming out of the reverie I was in of singing this in the sweat, which was quite a powerful experience, I see that Randy has left the sweat and is standing on the bank of the river, tears pouring down his face. And he turns around to me and he says, mate, I just saw all the Gaelic peoples who had settled in these lands and connected with my nation and married into our nation. I just saw all of their spirits come back, hearing their language sung for the first time in decades, right? And that hit me like a ton of bricks. Like I get shivers across my body just thinking of that moment now, but realizing like, wow, there's healing here too, not just for, white folk, but for mixed ancestry folk of any origin, who have some Gaelic roots to reconnect with that and to heal from that colonial rupture. So I would say my journey, and I'd encourage, this is what I do with Deep Roots, is trying to help us as Northern folk reconnect with our roots, whether that's Gaelic or, Southern French or, countryside English or German or what have you, reconnect with our roots, dig where we stand, as Alistair McIntosh says, so we can encounter the incredible nourishing crack of our culture, and share that and not show up as hungry ghosts, but show up as someone who's able to bring our own, bread, oat cakes, to the circle.
That story is so deep. Thank you for sharing and singing before it that way that these old songs open the door for all the shivers. Like, yeah.
Yeah, man.
Um, and that um, I really resonate with the way in which like the old language and the old stories and the old protocols like they allow you like even as a person living in diaspora the protocols and the like way of thinking that's inside the stories and the songs and the practices actually allows me to dig with less hunger where I stand, even here in Turtle Island, like
Hmm.
that sense of, I've heard Tyson Yunkaporta put it the way of like, you know, a lot of these teachings, they don't teach you what to think, they teach you how to think.
Hmm.
And that when I'm with the stories, when I'm studying the like folk magic traditions that I participate in, um, suddenly what I'm with is how to be on landscape,
Hmm.
how to be in culture, how to be with others, how to be with the other others, right?
Hmm.
Those less human others
Hmm.
in ways that um don't can happen here in really meaningful ways.
Hmm.
When I know that my people knew that there was like a nix or a knockin in this waterfall or
Hmm.
waterfalls like this, and I can approach it with that sense and not be like, oh, okay, well, this has to be a nix or a knockin because I'm that's the little world that I'm living in, but actually the spirit in the place, I have enough of a tendril of
Hmm.
protocol that the spirit
Hmm.
in the place can meet me and be like, okay, that's not quite who I am,
Hmm.
but it's enough
Hmm.
for us to be together, which has been for me the most nourishing for that hungry ghost part of me. It's been so
Hmm.
nourishing to know that now I have something to offer,
Hmm.
and there's a rope of connection of like that spirit can be like, okay, well, you kind of got my name right. It'll work for today,
Hmm.
and can you go get some chocolate, please? Because that's what I need. These kinds of
Hmm.
repeated experiences I've had on the landscape here,
Hmm.
and how what you bring me to is like being a good ally, at least in how I have come to understand it, being a good ally to the humans, that
Hmm.
one family that you and Prashant are
Hmm.
summoning in that journey, also means being the deepest ally I can be to the spirits of place
Hmm.
and the material place,
Hmm.
um, and that there is no I can't show up for the struggle. I can't show up for the struggle in the human realm if I'm not right with all of those other rings
Hmm.
of
Hmm.
connection.
Absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely. Yeah, and just to kind of riff off of you, that makes me think of another thing that strikes me as important in this particular work, coming to it from the identity I have, which is also the kind of intersectional privileged place of safety that we as white skinned people get to have in digging where we stand, because our
mhm,
culture, I can rock down the street in a kilt and I'll be applauded everywhere other than maybe Glasgow, different parts of
mhm,
Scotland where you'll have the piss ripped out of you because of the internal colonization and the nuances of the kilt that Scots understand. But otherwise, as white folks, we can reclaim culture and it's applauded, whereas so many other people's reclaiming their culture, wearing their culture, they will be criminalized one way, implicitly or explicitly. And just as you're saying, I relate to what you say, Chase, of, it's so important to be right in every sense, grounded, connected with kind of the spirit realm, with yourself, with your ancestors, to show up to work in a good way. And what a privilege to be able to do that, right?
mhm,
When I think of so many of my Indigenous pals, organizers, activists who are like, I would love to be right with every realm, but I've got, kids to get to school and this and that, and the intersectional struggles that colonized peoples have, whereas I experience the privilege and benefits of having come from people who were colonized and then swiftly became beneficiaries of the colonial project. So in the Deep Roots work, another thing that I try to address is not that there's necessarily anything wrong with depoliticized kind of reclamation of spirituality. But I think with a lot of the movements that are growing in a very beautiful way, the flourishing movements of sort of, let's say, like neo-spirituality amongst white-skinned people, there is a lot of political bypassing. There is a lot of
oh,
erasure of the political realities that come with reclaiming culture, relearning culture, showing up as an ally, or showing up to defend a piece of land as white people, which is great. It's great that we do that. It's great that we help. other land defenders and put ourselves on the front lines because we have that added privilege. But if we don't step back into our culture hand in hand with stepping into politics of solidarity and understanding our our privilege and positionality, especially in Turtle Island, then it can lead to this kind of, an added layer of white superiority, right? So I think for me, it's been a deep lesson of humility, of I'm very much entitled to this journey of reclaiming my culture, and with that comes responsibility of learning what the voices of racialized peoples, of working class communities are telling us as white folks, as Northerners, that look, reclaim your culture and remember that we need you to reclaim your culture, become strong in that, and then join us
Hmm.
in a good way in the struggles that are also part of our collective liberation, right? Because that's how I understand collective liberation. We can only, me as a Scottish Canadian, I can only really work towards my own holistic collective liberation if it is inherently connected to the struggles for collective liberation of the Indigenous people whose lands I grew up on, for example.
Hmm. Yes. Thank you. Yeah, this is a point at which in the conversation often I'm having with people or in the gatherings we're doing, where sometimes mm, I love it, the depoliticized, um I'm going to use illusion, and that might be triggering to some people, but like
Hmm.
the illusion of
Yeah, yeah.
depoliticizing of the spiritual, quote unquote, um, really is strong. Like,
Hmm.
oh, I should just be able to celebrate these holidays, to have this relationship with my house spirit, to engage with the spirits of the land, and not have it be tied in with these like wider systems,
Mm.
because it feels good, or because it gives me a sense of being healed, or and I'm entitled to it. And when we then, like you're doing here, like really highlight the way that it is a political action
Hmm.
to do those things, and that must happen in concert with a bunch of other types of solidarity work,
Hmm.
because that it can get contentious, right? It's
Hmm.
like, because we live or as a white racialized person, right, I live in this sense of um a lack of attunement to the ways in which every aspect of life is
Hmm.
interwoven with
Hmm.
systems of polity, um that you put it so like better than I've ever heard, of like how important it is to like keep our finger on that pulse.
Hmm.
um I've been really heartened lately. Recently, Scott Richardson Reed from Kayaks
Hmm. Yep.
Herbarium put out
Yep.
an incredible article on fairy rebellions.
Hmm.
And then also I heard Morgan Daimler talk about fairy rebellions on Chad Andros' Radical Elfheim podcast recently. But just this awakening that I'm hoping more and more people in living in the diaspora are starting to understand, that the political nature of relationship with the good folk or the
Hmm.
other
Hmm.
spiritual
Hmm.
aspects of culture goes way further back than just like,
Hmm.
oh, I'm standing here at our event trying to make this political for you. It's like, no, like
Hmm.
this is the history, more than
Absolutely.
it's not a deviation from the norm for my
Hmm.
relationship with the good folk to be deeply connected to my refusal of tyranny.
Hmm.
um
Hmm.
and I think I'm hoping that we are starting to get to that place in these communities that are longing for reconnection, that
Hmm.
the relationship to the earth and the relationship to the others is like you said, that's the sustenance that makes
Hmm.
our showing up for the um the struggle, the beautiful struggle.
Hmm.
That's what feeds it. And also hopefully gives it the cues, right? Like gives it the protocol, like how much protocol comes from the the beings of the landscape, and how
Hmm.
often in the folklore these beings are giving very strong very strong messages of
Hmm.
of protocol. This is how you're
Yeah,
supposed to be here, and if you're not going to be here this way, we're going to break all your tools. we,
absolutely.
you know,
Absolutely.
roads don't go here, and if you
Yeah.
cut this tree,
Hmm.
all of your machines will break, and you may even die. So
Yeah.
you know that these. I mean, it's it. It always flabbergasts me when people try to cast it as non-political because I'm
Yeah.
like,
No.
uh, are you reading the folklore? Are you hearing the stories from these people? Like,
Hmm.
it's all there. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's amazing, Chase, that you're drawing that out, and it's really inspiring to know that you're doing the kind of gatherings you're doing and the work you're doing in California, because I think I'm very lucky, very privileged to be able to bring people into the land in Scotland, where the land does most of the hosting for us, right? And I just get to point to it, right? Point to the pre-colonial sort of patterns and ways of doing things. But that's very much what the Deep Roots work is about. It's bringing people onto the land with culture bearers who, day one you're learning hide tanning with Peter and Anne, and this incredible hide tanner, born and raised in the Highlands of Scotland, and he's such a natural tradition bearer. He bears the tradition beautifully, and you're working a roe deer hide from the mountain you're looking at, eating that meat for dinner, and the next day you're learning an Irish song with Aoife, who then brings you through a Celtic sweat. And then day three, we're talking activism, we're talking solidarity, scalable tactics. How do we show up as allies? What are the struggles we're part of? And how do we bring these seeds of cultural grounding back to our struggles back home, whether that's in Edinburgh, Glasgow, the Highlands, or California, or, New Zealand, or what have you, and having great crack while we're at it, right? Like having recognizing that this can't all be dour and dark and shame and guilt based. It has to be joyful. It has to be that beautiful combination of joy and responsibility, and joyful responsibility, that with reclaiming these roots and these life ways, we're breathing life back into, as you're saying, into a way of being that is inherently anti-colonial, that is inherently anti industrial in many ways, that is inherently about regeneration of land and spirit. So it's a delight. It's such a delight. And to anyone listening, come. You're very much welcome and invited. I mean, I think it really is time. Myself as diaspora, I want to really share the message from folks back home in Scotland that, like, it's time for folks who were separated from Scotland, from Ireland, from those northern lands to come back, both physically and culturally, and reclaim the stake we have in that living culture while it's still alive, because we need help to breathe it back to life. And there's a gorgeous lyric from the Proclaimers, the I would walk 500 miles, those lads. They have another
Mhm.
song that has a line that my buddy Michael Yellowlees, who's from the east side of Scotland, from Burnham, read out to me while we were standing on the banks of the Tay River, that he grew up on, that my mum grew up on. And it is, when will you come back, my blood, to help breathe life into a dying mutual friend? That friend being
Mm.
Scotland. And it's that calling back to the diaspora to return and help folks in Scotland, help the Scots breathe life back into the traditions and practices of Scotland, because it is richer with that reunion of the diaspora and the folks who didn't leave.
Mm.
So consider yourself invited, Chase. I can't wait to have you come to a gathering and bring some of your crew. And also, we're ready to come to you now. Like,
Mhm.
I'll get a wee band together, and we'll bring the crack and I'll bring my
Mhm.
small pipes, and see if Aoife can come with a harp. And feed the movements across Turtle Island of folks who are doing, mixed ancestry settlers who are doing such incredible work to defend the land and stand in solidarity, because we know that those communities need nourishment as well and need support. And that's it. It's the mutual aid, the sort of diasporic mutual aid network that I feel really called to be part of reweaving across the waters. And that's why the July gathering is called Healing Across Waters. It's really recognizing that we need to bring back together those who left with those who stayed, to
Mm.
kind of find ourselves again.
That's beautiful. Wow. I've been thinking a lot about the ways that the waters figure into our sense of place, and
Mm,
and how that is significantly different um to pre-colonial people than I think it is to the current folk in the world
Hmm.
for many reasons. And I've been thinking a lot about this particular story that happened in my life where in I really didn't have a sense of my ancestry beyond the like vague notion that there's and it was I came to Scotland and Wales and England, and I ended down in Devon,
Mm.
um, and it was on that trip that I actually received both like a DNA
Mm.
breakdown, and a package from my grandfather
Oh
of
wow.
my family tree going back to 1435.
Oof, mate.
And it was, this huge
Wow.
experience. And being on that trip, trying to really deepen into that being on the land,
Mm.
being in land,
Mm.
because
Mhm.
and um it was through that door that I first started doing any of the kind of spirit work that I do. Um, and when I was on that trip, I got had this like series of weird synchronicities that led me to studying Swedish folk magic,
Mm.
which was just to me at the time uh, kind of out of nowhere because I don't have any Swedish ancestry. I was just following the call, right, of the spirits, um and then it kind of, the part of me that was really wanting to have my politics and my practice aligned with each other was always questioning, like, what can
Mm.
I am I doing this? Am I doing
Mhm.
this the right way? Can I be doing this? And at a certain point I had this um visitation from an ancestor, like
Mm.
very very potently, and I this ancestor laid out to me that, yeah, you know I'm from this part of Scotland, which
Mm.
then I was able to verify,
Oh wow.
um and um
Wow.
but the magic that I am doing here right now, these like little protocols and life ways that I'm living out as a person who's doing this or was doing this in my life, are pretty similar or identical to what's going on in Sweden. And that's why I'm
Mm.
sending you that direction. And
Mm.
it was this moment
Wow.
of like, okay, you take everything a spirit says to you with a grain of salt because
Mm.
there's because there's so much going on, right?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Um, and so this was 8 years ago. And over the years, it's become this really strange unfolding where I'm now reading the folklore from Scotland and reading the witchcraft trials and reading all of these things and seeing
Mm.
all of
Wow.
these synchronicities.
Hmm.
And then meeting Scott Richardson Reed, who's now my very good friend, and
Amazing.
him, we studied with the same teacher from Sweden. And when I asked him
Wow.
why he did that, he said it's because the practices are really close or
Mm.
identical.
Wow.
And the way that I've finding that this is connected to the oceans is that I think for seafaring cultures, which both the Scandinavian culture and that the Scottish culture, for fishing cultures, for seafaring cultures, like the
Hmm.
ocean is actually the most connective element. It's
Absolutely.
not it's a border, not a boundary.
Absolutely.
And we know that borders are where the most culture explodes.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and this has been like a total revelation for me as somebody who practices in one tradition but has mixed ancestry of another, to know that this kind of story we have of boundaried ancestral cultures
Hmm. Hmm.
actually um actually is not what it felt like,
Mm.
I
Hmm.
think, for
Hmm.
my ancestral
Hmm.
people. And that when you have two cultures that are coming with intact protocols, and this is not to say it was all groovy all the time, because we know it wasn't, especially between Scotland and Scandinavia, but that all of this stuff is getting traded back and forth, including these practices. And
Hmm.
I feel so lucky that, this little spirit synchronicity, huge spirit synchronicity, not to like diminish it, because now
Hmm.
my ancestors are kind of poking me, like, don't
Oh,
diminish
yeah, yeah,
this.
absolutely. Yeah.
This huge actually has led me to be able to have that experience of having connected with my blood ancestry through this
Hmm.
other tradition that was available to
Hmm.
receive me,
Hmm.
in a way
Yeah.
that getting brought into the Gaelic tradition wasn't available at that time,
Yeah.
you know, for me.
Yeah.
And so a lot of what I've been trying to support folks, what our Animus West County crew has been trying to support folks with here at our gatherings, is coming to understand that ecological reality of ancestry more than the national ecology of
Hmm.
ancestry.
Hmm.
And we've been talking a lot about the shoals of herring, the Bonnie shoals of herring, as a um, earth reality of interconnection between all of these Gaelic speaking isles and
Hmm.
Scandinavia and Iceland. That
Hmm.
these shoals move, and also the English speaking isle, like down into
Yeah.
Albion, that folks with mixed ancestry finding some identity with these migrating fish
Hmm.
actually
Yeah.
serves us to remember that it's not about um, finding some authentic national
Hmm.
identity when we're finding our roots. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Chase, thank you so much because that segues beautifully into another thing that I'm increasingly finding a sort of a sense of urgency to speak to, which in Scotland we're seeing an astonishingly fast and broad rise of strange forms of nationalism. And
Mm-hmm.
Scottish national, don't get me wrong, nationalism is the one country whose white country, more or less, culturally, historically white country, whose nationalism I can actually get behind. Because in so many circumstances, Scotland has said, right, England is being this xenophobic, we will be this inclusive to asylum seekers. And, in Scotland, an asylum seeker is just called a new Scot. Right? Like it's very
Mm-hmm.
inclusive. But right now we're seeing a very strange mix of the worst of England and the US's far right, sort of born again Christian, um, homophobic, xenophobic, transphobic, the rest of it. Deeply racist, deeply patriarchal politics spreading across Scotland, and it's often a horseshoe with the traditional kind of back to the land movements in the sense that like
Mm-hmm.
the far right and the far left are actually very close together.
Yeah.
And people jump, and the right is really claiming a lot of people from the movement. Um, Within that caveat, nothing wrong with Christianity. If that's your thing, beautiful. Jesus was an undocumented, brown skinned migrant. Excellent. But just to come back to the point, what you're saying really reminds me that, I mean, as you said it yourself, it was never national borders. The Gaelic peoples were not Scots, they were not Irish, they were Gaels. And Gaels from the west coast of Scotland would have been, trading fish with Gaels from the east coast of Ireland way more than Scots from the east coast of Scotland. And
Mm-hmm.
the shoals of herring, as a Gael of one part, you would have interacted with the herring that swam to Norway more than you would have interacted with someone from the other side of Scotland. So
Mm-hmm.
truly, I think this is a time when we need to not just learn these things for the beautiful poetic truths they are, but again, realize that historical, ecological truth also should bring us to political conclusions of
Mm-hmm.
understanding that, right, this is not about nationalism. This is not about building walls to keep immigrants out. This is about recognizing that we are all people who have moved and migrated, and that our culture is informed by the land, first and foremost, not by any certain banner. And to put it under a certain banner would be to freeze the culture and to kill it. Whereas Gaels, I mean, if bagpipes are played in Greece and Turkey and Afghanistan and Pakistan, as well as the north of France and Scotland and Ireland. And, like we have so much more in common than we don't. And what we needn't fear is people of culture coming to these lands. What we should be excited for is um, as Gaels, and I only identify partly as a Gael because I didn't grow up in the culture. I didn't grow up in the reality, but as someone who is impassioned about preserving Gaelic culture, I feel the excitement of having other friends of culture like Prashant from India when he got to Scotland. He was, promoting Gaelic culture louder than anyone. And the other day I was in I was in kind of the dodgy end of Edinburgh looking for some mechanical bits and pieces, walking around the big shops in the kind of warehouse industrial sector. And I went into a kilt shop that just, is an industrial tin roof kind of silo that said, we make kilts. And I walked in and it was all folks from India making kilts. And they all had, thick Edinburgh Indian accents, and they were kilt makers. And how do we deny that? Like, great, thank you for keeping the culture alive. So I think, like the shoals of herring, we need to recognize that culture moves. Culture is land-based. It's not tied to a certain banner or nationalism. And now, as we see rising, especially amongst the movements or within the movements of Back to the Land, um, we need to recognize that we must return to the land, return to our practices in a politics of solidarity now more than ever.
Yeah, no, yeah, it's so there's so many tendrils in that horseshoe that you're pointing out, and
Mm,
that the ways in which the hunger for belonging that I feel coming from the orphanhood of the of diaspora, right? Like, and to take that from Stephen Jenkinson, like that there's this orphanhood of diaspora that creates that hunger because there hasn't been the sustenance of the land, and then how that can lead to that, what I'm hearing you describe as that kind of blood and soil
hmm
eco-fascist reality, um,
hmm
that is so attractive to people who feel uh, displaced,
hmm
and how what I think I hear us pointing at is actually that is to engage with a a fantasy version of the land, not the land itself.
hmm
That, if it takes having like a certain blood and a certain national identity to be of land, like,
hmm
to me that's a fantasy,
hmm
because when you actually look at the landscape, it's at like the real earth, when you really get out there in the woods, that's not what it's like at all. I mean, we just had last week a friend of mine who's a birder, um, and also one of my someone I've done a lot of magical work with, texted me a picture of a goshawk on her porch in Sebastopol, and we're out of goshawk range.
hmm
There's no reason a goshawk should be here other than climate
hmm
weirding, and it was for it was such a like shocking thing of like, why is there goshawk? And so the reality is, like, people living outside of their range is actually the norm
hmm Yeah.
on the earth.
Yeah.
And to get into that reality, that the weird, that the out of place, the uncanny, the strange is actually the norm,
hmm
that's the feel of really being alive,
hmm
is a really, for me, this way in which the sort of fantasy dream of empire can
hmm
get washed away from our eyes, because empire says things are normal.
hmm Yeah.
Things run according to what we think they'll be. William Blake, the poet, calls it Newton's sleep.
Mm.
Like, this, we've got all these rules now that govern the universe, and they always work.
hmm
And so we can go to sleep. We don't have to think. We don't have to watch anymore.
Yeah.
Um, when really being awake is a much more strange affair than
hmm
things making sense according to
hmm
national boundaries or
hmm
ecological boundaries or yeah.
hmm Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, thinking of this phenomenon that we're seeing across the board too, of sort of a rise in extreme, yeah, fascism and essentially fear-based politics, and therefore behavior, whether that's, Trump's America or Nigel Farage's UK. Also, it calls me back to a place of what I've learned from and sort of frame as trauma-informed approach to understanding that people who are hurt, right? And when you look at, the last names of so many people in the US and Canada serving in, the military and policing, it's Max and Mix and Robertsons and Stewarts, right? And recognizing that a lot of the harm of displacement of Gaels led to a culture rooted in that trauma that hasn't had the chance to heal, and hasn't been held in a healing way. And so I think I also want to sort of urge any listeners, as it were, to look beyond that, the horseshoe, look beyond the left and right, and not give in to the polarization that we're all being encouraged to give into, which again is just pitting community against community, when in reality, with a trauma-informed sort of approach, understanding that we all just need to heal. It's like, how do we call the Trumps back in, and the Trump supporters and whoever else in, to saying, look, you don't have to fear this thing you fear. In fact, it's not going to be immigrants taking away your jobs that's going to lead to the end of the world as you know it. It's going to be the current systems that are making people immigrate because of the, American neo-imperial global political kind of way of messing up Central America, for example, right? That's why people are coming. In fact, if we band together and put some tatties in the ground, carrots in the ground, food crops in the ground, if we learn each other's land-based ways of sustaining ourselves and birthing babies and, doing herbal healthcare and all these things that actually build autonomy, we can move beyond this whole dichotomy of left and right and find kind of what I think a lot of people of culture would refer to as more like the middle path that is outside of those politics and recognizes that everyone deserves healing, everyone deserves care, and sort of that nervous system sigh and relief, and knowing that, like, you don't need to be up in arms. We can do this together. And with that, I think comes the moving away from a scarcity politics to an abundance politics, right? And mindset and cosmology. And you see that in Gaelic culture and songs that talk about the incredible abundance the land gives, mountains that are butter in the summer, and lyrics like this that just remind you that the Gael lived in a sense of abundance in so many ways. So how do we call that abundance back in? How do we move away from politics of fear and politics that other each other, whether it's the right othering the left or the left othering the right, and feeling a sense of superiority, moral superiority? How can we all just recognize we all have the same basic needs, and we all deserve to have those needs attended to? And rerouting into our pre-colonial cultures is, for me, a very tangible step towards doing that, that kind of obliterates party politics, and reveals us to be what we are, which is children of this big, bountiful, beautiful Mama Earth hurtling through the universe that we're all on.
The way in which you said that when I allow myself that thought, sometimes I feel like I'm bypassing. Like when I go for like we're all children of the earth, but to build it from the perception of abundance and from that real deep connection to the real earth and that hands in the soil kind of place, and how that leads us to the reality of like all people need healing, and all I think that there's part of it in that when you say it that way, like they all need healing and we all deserve healing, that
hmm
like it obliterates the sort of bypass for me. I'm like, no,
hmm
a North Star that allows for the reality of the struggle and the
Mhm.
pain and all of the work that it's going to take, all the
Mhm.
restorative work that it would take for us to sit in that kind of circle,
Mhm.
and I
Mhm.
think that that's something that these cultures that we're speaking about, the Gael culture and also the cultures of that I've been introduced to here in Turtle Island and also in Scandinavia, that like this doesn't preclude the connection doesn't preclude that there's work of restoration that needs to be done,
Mhm.
and there's strong protocols for how to come back into alignment and reconciliation with people who have perpetuated colonial harm,
Mhm. Mhm.
um, and and how that is such an important part of um, reclaiming culture, like beyond the crack, beyond the groovy
Mhm.
part. That
Mhm.
also reclaiming culture includes reclaiming new understandings around um, harm and reconciliation,
Mhm.
and um, and moving beyond the sorts of like uh, prison incarceration
Mhm.
world that we live in, right? Which would
Mhm.
ask me to, on the inside, incarcerate all of those people who I disagree with,
Mhm.
right? Like I'm
Yeah.
walking around with that a carceral
Yeah.
perception that
Mhm.
reconnecting with the earth and reconnecting with the roots that go deep down into the earth actually asked me to then ask the questions about how is like does my carceral perception of the other jive with how
Mhm.
I know my ancestors to have lived in this world?
Mhm. Mhm.
Based on the stories I know, not so much.
Mhm. Mhm.
You know
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, and I think for me, a lot of this, I understand in the framework of accountability, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's accountability. We're all children of this world, and we are all accountable for our actions and our ancestors' actions. And it was the Irish, an Irish leader. I forget if it was Ireland's current president or no. I think it was something an Irish leader said 100 years ago or something. But it was talking about colonial accountability in it essentially, and it was saying, I don't hold your average English person to be guilty of the crimes of their ancestors, what they did to Ireland, unless they continue to live on the privilege built up, resulting from that colonial violence. And if the
Mm-hmm.
answer to that is yes, then I do hold them accountable. And then that's how
Mm-hmm.
I understand my own story and responsibility. And that's how I would encourage other settlers to think of it of it's not about guilt, it's not about shame, but it's about being accountable and recognizing I live with a certain amount of privilege, wealth, stability, access to whatever. That is a direct result of the accumulation of colonial wealth that my ancestors have been part of the colonial project in the US or Canada or what have you. Therefore, not therefore I should be guilty or paralyzed or shame-based, but therefore I have skin in the game. I have a responsibility, and for me, that's a joyful responsibility to be called to action and solidarity. And I think that accountability is sort of it is my North Star. It is my joyful compass to help me navigate my role within this kind of work that is decolonial and that asks me to yeah, not pretend, okay, right, I'm reconnecting with my culture, therefore I'm not a colonizer, and kind of
Mm-hmm.
bypassing that identity, but owning it and saying, right, yeah, my family immigrated here just one generation ago, so I haven't been part of the colonial project here for a long time, but they absolutely built their wealth as, middle class Brits through the British colonial project, just even staying in Britain. So how do I show up, to work towards decolonial ends in Scotland, not without the lived experience of a working class Scot, but with the lived experience of a middle class person accrued through the colonial project. And that accountability is what steers me through that, what reminds me of my responsibilities of the things I can speak to and cannot speak to. It's what keeps me right. And I feel like
Mm-hmm.
when you have a framework of accountability, it allows you to kind of not magically shed that guilt. I certainly live with my own, I think, probably healthy dose of sort of uh who am I to do this complex that I think, lots of folks have. But it I think it can keep us on the straight and narrow when we're doing work to remain humble, to remain curious, to remain open to being put right by folks too. Like I'm doing this work ultimately as a Canadian in Scotland. I may be
Hmm.
one half a generation removed, but mates like Agav and Aoife and other folks I work with will put me right sometimes and remind me like,
Hmm.
Ben, you have no lived experience of that. And I think that's another thing for us to learn how to be comfortable with is that discomfort of being put right sometimes and actually yearn for it, yearn for those mild corrections because as oh, who was it who says this? Conflict is an invitation towards greater intimacy. And I think when we move out of that narrative of confidence or deep insecurity, which actually I think often go hand in hand, and we move out of that very ego-bound way of living into a place of like error is fine, it's okay to fail, it's okay to make mistakes on this path. We can move beyond that paralysis, and we can learn how to start showing up as best we can, knowing we'll make mistakes and asking to be put right. If we don't know the protocol, asking what the protocol is, whether that's showing up to a frontline, an Indigenous-led frontline in the US or Scotland, going to a gathering or meeting with an elder. Lots of settlers from Turtle Island are going back to places like Scotland and Ireland to collect stories, this and that. Ask what the protocol is, ask to be put right. Um, and that certainly is what helps me to do the work in a good way and in a way that is accountable.
Hmm. Yeah, I love that reality that you're pointing out of that true humility, which knows which knows it will cross boundaries. Like I think that that's part of being that of humble is that like we know we will bump up against each other. One of my folks that I've really studied um it as a just like entree because my wife's family is really connected is Dominic Barter, the restorative circles trainer and creator. And he really points out like we have a kitchen because we eat. We should also have a place in our life for conflict because conflict is inevitable. And so the intentional community that my wife's family started has an actual room for conflict with a huge window that looks out over the garden. So if you're in a conflict, everybody knows you're in a conflict because there's this picture window showing what's happening. Um, and the beauty of that
Mhm.
and the way in which that's connected with everything that you're bringing forward of we I think folks in the diaspora here in California, we get into this dream of authenticity, like doing it right.
Mhm.
Is this the way that it has been done for since time immemorial? Is this right the right way? Is that the right way to tell the story? I run into this a lot as a
Mhm.
storyteller, a storyteller who learns in the oral tradition. People are like, I know Johnny Cash wasn't in that story, so why'd you throw it in there? Whatever these little things
Mhm.
that happen are, um, that ultimately a living culture plays around, adds things, bumps up against other things, has conflict, and
Mhm.
it's that yearning for correction instead of
Mhm.
that yearning to be right and to
Mhm.
be patted
Mhm.
on the back that I think makes that really feed like a living culture.
Mhm.
And we're at this phase, hopefully, I'm finding in some of these circles, and it sounds like in your circles too, where um, perfect authenticity isn't actually the goal
Mhm.
anymore. Like
Mhm.
ancestral cosplay is what my friend Marcus McCoy, the blacksmith, calls it. Like, but that's not what we're talking about. It's not what we don't want to Renaissance fair our ancestry.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're actually trying to find that living spark of connection, which involves all of these elements of grief
Mhm.
and joy and pain and conflict.
Mhm.
But it's the protocol and the map and the guidance and the compass, the joyful compass. I think. Thank you for that metaphor of these old ways that allows us to conflict and joy and grief.
Hmm.
well,
Hmm.
um,
Yeah.
or to do the ceremony wrong and then be willing to have somebody be like, hey,
Yeah.
good one, and next
Yeah.
time, not so much, you know.
Yeah. That's beautiful. That's beautifully put. Yeah, and I think there's a balance between, so again, speaking from my own experience and kind of not just my experience up until now, but what I reckon will be my experience ahead. On the one hand, I will never be born and raised Scot. I identify as someone who is coming from a Gaelic background, but I wouldn't say I'm a Gael. So I will always be an in-betweener. I'll always be a bit of a bridge. And I'll never, do it the way my Gaelic ancestors would have exactly. And I embrace that and I'm aware of that. And I love the reality of living culture. Yeah, my sister's wedding is in a few days, and she asked me to sing some songs, and I was, trying to think what song would be nice, and I was playing through different tunes, and then a song came to me in Gaelic, and it's the song of Kate and her man's wedding, and I wrote it down, and that's me writing a Gaelic song, and I'm sure it's I sent it to Agav, and he puts me right with the grammar. So I do want to be part of creating living culture, even if it's not perfect. And I don't want to be doing that from a place of seeking perfection and perfect authenticity and the rest of it. And I want to do so in a free way that creates new culture and recognizing that diasporic culture is a thing. Like, think of the
Mhm,
amazing contributions to African culture that African diaspora around the world has brought back to Africa. Think of the same for Latin American culture that and or Arabic, culture, Indian, subcontinental Indian culture from Indian diaspora. Like we're allowed as diaspora to be diaspora Gaels and create our own strange reimagination. So all of that kind of positive, encouraging world I hold, and I try to hold it in balance with the humble sort of apprenticeship model that
mhm,
all all indigenous cultures, all pre-colonial cultures in the world have.
mhm,
There's a mentorship pathway somehow, right? Where you have an elder who you know, respect and follow and learn from. And then when they say, or your community says, right, mate, you're ready, you become a tradition bearer yourself. So I think for me personally, it's a balance of those two. It's a balance of
mhm,
the like, yeah, I'm gonna write a Gaelic song and this and that, and invent a new way of doing a blessing to the water based on what I've learned, and knowing that I'm still actually in the learning process.
mhm,
Yeah, and that's lovely. I love going from one to the other, having moments where I get to share and moments where I get to be at the feet of elders and be, a young pup who knows that I know nothing. And I think,
mhm,
again, that's the joy. That's the joy in not knowing. That's the joy in not knowing I'll never be a perfect, authentic whatever. And
mhm,
no human has.
mhm, mhm. Yeah. Yeah. There's this ballast that happens when you have both of those things going.
Hmm.
And that, that ship keel that is then made to go
Hmm.
following that joyful compass when you have both of those things.
Yeah.
Because if you have just the riff, then you're spinning in a circle. But if
Yeah.
you have just the sitting, then it can, or just the waiting,
Hmm.
and just the like, oh, I'll never know, those kinds of elements that are inside of there. That's also its own kind of spiral
Hmm.
spin. So I love what you're bringing forward of, like, we need both of those elements to be in closer harmony with each
Hmm.
other.
Hmm.
um, and I think that yearning for course correction that you bring up is what allows that ballast to make us go, is
Hmm.
because we know that at any moment the right thing to happen is a course correction from
Hmm.
someone
Hmm.
who's watching us and being with us. And that, so much of so many of my mentors in my life who have meant so much to me, the moments of deepest mentoring have been blessing, but also been, I see you off course,
Hmm.
and here's what I see, how you could get back on course.
Hmm.
um
Hmm.
and take it or leave it. but hopefully take it because I'd love to
Yeah.
stay in relationship with you. These
Yeah.
kinds of elements that I feel so thankful for with the folks who have um, been willing to mentor me in my life,
Mhm.
um, and that ultimately um, that's really what serves. And I love everything that you're bringing forward that like leads us in that direction of like really get out there and play,
Mm.
but get out there and play with protocol because
Mhm.
every game has rules.
Mhm. Mhm.
Every the
Mhm.
funnest games in the world have rules, and we got
Mhm.
to know them to be in the
Yeah.
fun. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. Yeah, for years I worked as a sea kayak guide off the west coast, the Northwest Pacific, and it was magic. And we were doing a training where we, as guides, we were being trained up by Scott actually, and we were in quite intense waters in a channel between islands off the west coast of Canada, of Turtle Island, where if the current kicks up, it gets to flat water turns into moving water,
Mm,
and you can get flipped and you can get shot out to the Olympic Mountains, where entire ships can get pulled down. Like it's quite a decisive moment. And so you typically are trained to calculate the tides and currents such as to hit that at slack tide when the tide is neither going in or out, and you shoot through the channel and it's all gravy. But we were sent in when it was turning to train in sculling and bracing, it's called, where you're being flipped by the water and you push your paddle down and spread
mm,
the butter, they say, with your paddle
mm,
on the surface of the water to pop yourself back up. Anyway, um, I came away from it and it took me a few days to realize, wow, it's like life. It's not about avoiding the moving water, it's about having the skills to navigate it. And
mhm,
that continues to be a lesson for me in the work that we're talking about. I often don't know how to do the thing that I feel called to do. I often don't know exactly how to show up or what will be asked of me. Even with the Deep Roots work, I know I'm meant to be doing this through whatever intuitive kind of forces, and it being reflected back at me from the people I'm working with and bringing into the work. I don't know exactly what my role is in it, how to show up. I do have or imposter syndrome all the time, organizing things in Scotland, not being a, full-blooded this, that Gael. But that's okay. I can manage those waters. I can manage those moments, as you say, of correction, of being corrected, or realizing myself, oh, I'm tipping.
mhm,
And I think, yeah, if we can, that's what I try to do in the Deep Roots work is alongside the team of people who I get to work with, creating a space where the folks who come, the participants, who often come from diaspora culture as well as across Scotland and the UK, help people get those skills to right yourself in moving
mhm,
water. That keel, that compass, that rudder, that mast, that sail, so we can do this work in a good way and so we can navigate the tricky waters because we need people to be trained up, to be skilled enough to navigate the tricky waters of land back, of decolonial work, of not just talking about it, but of action, of actually making right with relations with Indigenous land stewards and with the land itself and with ourselves and with our families and the rest of it. So that's very much what I'm learning this Deep Roots work is meant to be, is bringing people into an absolute deep immersion of Highland culture that is so nourishing and filling people's cups and teaching some skills to navigate moving waters so people can go back home and share those seeds and skills and songs, and recipes for making oat cakes with their pals and nourish each other, but then move into those moving waters and navigate those tricky things that we're being called to. Because that's something else that I carry with me from all the different places I've lived, whether that's India or Chiapas and Zapatista territory in southern Mexico or Kyrgyzstan, all the different areas I've been privileged enough to live in. Everyone has said, Ben, when you get home, tell your northern culture, white skinned people that we need yous to stand up, step back into your cultural power and show up and help us fight this fight in a good way. So that's why we need to learn these skills.
mm. Wow. Thank you. Holy moly.
Yeah.
I feel so nourished and so uh in solidarity with the lucha, with the struggle that you're
Simón,
putting us
la lucha sigue.
in. and to be here with you is so nourishing. And so I'm curious, as we close this thing, is there anything that you want to invite people to let them know that's happening? I can also put links in the show notes, but just like as we're sitting here now, where can people find you and what should they be coming to?
Yeah, man. Yeah. So, depending on when people are hearing this, it is currently May. In July, we're having the next Deep Roots gathering, and that is at the Sheelan Collective in the north of Scotland. And everything we've been talking about is going to be happening at this gathering. This one is actually for diaspora exclusively because diaspora have different needs, and we're really designing this to be a powerful experience for diaspora. And that's a 6-day gathering, July 1st to July 6th. It's called Healing Across Waters, the Highland Welcome. And it will be gorgeous and deep and a journey of grieving that, disconnect and rupture and then returning people to culture in a really powerful way. And that's with a team of incredible activists and culture bearers from across Scotland and Ireland and around there. And outside of that, Deep Roots Alba, Deep Roots ALBA is the work. Deeprootsalpa.org is my nascent website that I'm still working on, and on Instagram it's just Deep Roots Alpa. And don't be a stranger. Get in touch. Ask when the next gathering is. If you can't make the one in July, there'll probably be another one in October, more or less. But they'll be seasonal and they're growing. And also, if there have been lots of folks calling me to California. So I think if there's enough people, 20 people, 15 people, 100 people, whoever, and they say, right, we're ready for you. Deep Roots can also travel, and we can bring a wee team across and bring the crack. So I let us reweave those bridges, both sides from both directions across the waters.
Yeah, may it be so. And you've got your 15 or 20 already, so let's get scheming. Uh,
Smashing. Let's do
yeah.
it, Gina.
Thank you so much for making the time today, Ben. It's been really, really good crack to be on with you.
Amazing. Chase, thank you. And like thank you for the work you're doing. It's truly inspiring. And that's I think the last thing I want to say is a reminder to you and to the people you work with that we need that cross-pollinization because folks in Scotland have certain cultural grounding and this and that folks in the diaspora need. And the incredible intersectional, rich cultures of activism and the rest of it in Turtle Island doesn't exist in Scotland, and we need those skills too. So let us create things together.
Indeed.
Chinny.
Beautiful.
Chinny. Smashing.